our first one on Zoom. And wherever you're joining from this evening, we're very glad to have you with us. My name is Helen McHugh, and I'm a member of the congregation. Our speaker tonight is Sam McBride, who really needs very little introduction. Sam is a journalist. He's the political editor of the Belfast newsletter, and he's a very regular contributor to radio and television. Indeed, many of you may have seen the documentary broadcast last week in which he and Dara McIntyre told the story of the Northern Bank robbery in Belfast in 2004. Sam is also the author of Burned, the inside story of the grossly mismanaged renewable heat initiative, or the Cash for Ash scheme. And the journalist Mark Davenport has described the book as superbly researched and explained with clarity and precision. And Noel Doran from the Irish News said it deserves to be studied by all those interested in our political process. Tonight, Sam will be speaking on the theme of truth in a time of pandemic and political change. And I think that title is even more appropriate now than it was when it was originally chosen. Sam, you are most welcome. We're also delighted to have with us the Reverend Dr. Johnson McMaster, who will be moderating this evening. Johnson, thank you too for being here with us. And now I will hand over to you.
Helen, thank you very much. I'm delighted to be part of this evening. And if I can outline the order of events, if you like, it's straightforward. Sam will give his lecture, about 40 minutes, I believe, and then we will go into what I hope will be an engaging and informal period of question and response. That's from about 8:15 up until about 5 to 9, and about 5 to 9 we will begin to wrap things up for the evening. So fairly straightforward. And Sam, it's over to you, I think now. Truth in a time of pandemic and political change. And when you're through, we'll manage the question and discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Johnston and Helen, for your kind introduction, and thank you for the invitation to be here tonight, if that's the correct way of describing such things in current circumstances. And thank you for your interest in journalism. Thank you for your invitation to come and speak on this topic in particular. I'm very sorry, obviously, that I can't be with you in person, but hopefully you can hear me clearly. And somebody please interject if you're not hearing me clearly, or if there are any difficulties. And just as has been said there, feel free to put a question into the chat at any point. I won't see it until the end, but if something crops up and you want to ask it, by all means put it in there, or at the end you can unmute yourself. We'll not stand on ceremony. So let's start at the start. What is journalism? It's really, I think, fundamentally pretty simple. It's about finding out what happened, recording that accurately, and explaining that in a form and with sufficient context that it can be comprehended by the reader, the listener, or the viewer. And journalism is really all around us, even if it's not always packaged as such. Since this is a Methodist event, dare I say that the Bible, I think, involves journalism of a sort. Of course, the Bible has a much deeper meaning for Christians, but much of what it records is about what happened, who said what, who disagreed with who, and doing that in a concise and readable format. That, to my mind, is journalism in its essence, really, albeit something which is very different perhaps to how we perceive journalism today. The best journalism is about taking complex concepts or developments and really distilling them down, simplifying them so that they can be easily understood. So that is something that might involve politics, it might involve science, it might involve a war, it might involve a riot, it could be anything. But it's about trying to take something that is important, that we need to know about, but we might be confused by it if it was presented to us by an expert, by an academic, by somebody who basically knew too much about the topic. And so the journalist is something of a generalist who comes in not often having a great deal of expertise in the area, but trying because of that to understand it themselves and then to convey that to whoever is listening or reading or watching what is being recorded. On the other hand, the worst form of journalism distorts the truth, and the worst journalists see themselves not as reporters who are conveying as much of the truth as they can establish and giving that to the public, but people who are attempting to shape public opinion by removing, embellishing, or even falsifying key facts in the narrative. And in many ways, journalism is all around us. Every one of you, I think, will have practiced journalism, even if you haven't thought of it as such. And even if your form of journalism, your style of journalism, or your topic might not make it onto the front page of the Times newspaper or onto a bulletin on Radio 4. But think about it like this. Even in families, journalism happens. Stories are told, differing accounts are relayed. Those accounts are then questioned, and sometimes they're corrected as new information emerges. And I think we probably all have experience of some relatives being more accurate journalists, let's say, than others when it comes to recording exactly what happened in a family setting. If you apologize for my slightly croaky throat here. So the Appointer Institute for Journalism in the United States sets out what I think are really three excellent guiding principles for journalists. The first is to seek truth and report it as fully as possible. The second is to act independently, i.e. don't be in the pay of somebody that you're reporting on. And the third is to minimize harm. You will all no doubt have examples of journalists and media outlets which live up to those values and those which fall very far short of that ideal. But whatever about the individual journalist or the journalistic outlet, I think it's fair to say that we're probably in an unprecedented time of challenge for journalism, particularly in the Western world. Newspapers are going out of business, or they are staying in business, but they're really giving up any pretense of public interest journalism because, bluntly, they can't afford to do it anymore. Television is already under pressure, and that is really going to accelerate very rapidly over the next few years. Just as an example of how quickly things are changing and how vast the change is, last year, Netflix spent $17 billion on original or acquired programming. For context, the BBC budget last year was about £4 billion. Netflix has come almost from nowhere, and in the space of something like a decade now dwarfs the BBC, something which has been part of all of our lives really from the moment that we were born. And the increasing acceleration of news that we have here in the 21st century, where we almost forget what was reported last week, let alone a few years ago, means that in the process, journalists, I think, risk making more mistakes, getting caught on a treadmill of breaking news with no time to sit back, to consider, or to investigate an issue with the benefit of time and reflection and analysis as to what has actually gone on. These issues aren't unique to Northern Ireland. We see them in the United States, for instance. We see the cries of the fake news media, the lying New York Times, the enemies of the people. We see in London, Laura Kuenssberg, the BBC political editor, getting death threats, having to have a bodyguard as she went to the Labour conference a few years ago. And the reason that this is happening to a certain extent is because those issuing these denunciations of journalism, these claims that that news is not actually accurate, that it is fake, that it is manufactured to suit someone else's agenda, is because it chimes with what so many voters already think. That's why Donald Trump said it, and that's why in many cases it worked. He ultimately lost the last election, but he got an extraordinary vote. I think many people in Northern Ireland in politics looking into that, as they do and as they wonder, does this work bluntly, if we set aside any moral qualms about it, will have concluded that to a certain extent it did work. It got him an extraordinary vote, and it managed to help him to sidestep all sorts of scandals and crises which any other politician really, without that in their arsenal, would not bluntly have been able to survive. And I think that one of the greatest threats to us in the media is really losing touch with the public, really becoming a bubble where we're speaking to each other and we are not connected to the society on which we report and which consumes our reports. Traditionally, there was a sense within newspapers, I think there was probably always an element of this being perhaps exaggerated, but there was certainly truth in this, that you could come in the door as a 15-year-old, a 16-year-old, whatever it might be, as a copy boy and work your way up to be the editor. That day has gone. Now, almost inevitably, to get into journalism, you need a degree, you need the debt which comes with that, which to people from a working class background is often eye-watering. It's something that is immediately a discouragement from getting into journalism, or even getting the means of getting into journalism, let alone getting a job in a media outlet. And one of the difficulties with that is that it brings with it a subliminal bias. That may be a bias of being socially liberal. It may be a bias of being overwhelmingly middle class. It may be a bias based on the color of our skin. It can be different things in different contexts. But just as an example of this, overwhelmingly, the way in which the media report on house price rises is as good news. And it's always something which has baffled me. It's perhaps because of my generation, even though I now own my home. When I started off as a journalist, I didn't. And I always looked at the front page of the Belfast Telegraph, where I worked at that point, or at other newspapers, or at the BBC or whatever, and wondered, why on earth are they reporting this as good news? It's not good news for me. It's not good news for my friends. It's not good news for people who feel that they're shut out of this market, or even if they do ultimately get into it, that it's becoming more and more expensive. And we wouldn't report that bread prices soaring was some sort of good news. I mean, it's a very curious thing. And I think it's one of several areas that reveal a subliminal bias, which really reflects that most of those in newsrooms who are doing the reporting own their own homes. And so therefore, for them, it's good news. For the people that are like them, it's good news. For lots of their friends, it's good news. But it's obviously disastrous news for somebody else. And I think that is one of the issues, where it's not about people setting out to distort the truth. It's not about journalists trying to do something that is wrong. It is something that is much subtler than that, and that therefore comes back ultimately to the makeup of newsrooms and the people who ultimately are making these editorial decisions within newspapers or in the broadcast media. In Northern Ireland, I think the media has been really successful in addressing the sectarian divide. That is something which I think overwhelmingly in Northern Ireland is not an issue in the media. There is a plurality of Catholic and Protestant, of unionist and nationalist, of people who represent all sorts of political views. But I think that other divides have opened up, and to a certain extent have taken the place of that bigger divide that many of us will be more familiar with. And this can seem pretty esoteric. It might seem like something that doesn't really matter to you as somebody who picks up a copy of the Irish Times, or who listens to UTV bulletins at lunchtime, or whatever it might be. But the reason that this matters is that if people don't trust the messenger, then the likelihood is that they won't trust the message which he or she is delivering. And that holds true even if that is a message about corruption, even if it's a message about incompetence, or something which is directly to the disadvantage of the individual hearing or receiving the news. It's a very effective way for those in power of shutting down awkward stories. Attack the messenger, and there's a good chance that the message will get lost in the mudslinging back and forth. And it is the case that being recognized for integrity in any walk of life or personally takes years to achieve, but it can be lost in an instant, in one ill-guarded moment. And I think it's true that we in the media have to be honest about what has happened in recent years within journalism. There has been a short-term recklessness to many media actions, even in what we now look back on, I think, in many cases as the heyday of journalism in the tail end of the 20th century. But that was an era where beneath some of the great journalistic stories that emerged there, real public interest journalism, there was phone hacking, there was the paparazzi, there was the sort of intrusive interference in private lives, which was based on what the public are interested in rather than what is in the public interest. And the melding, I suppose, as well of comment with news and the distortion of an opponent's argument, not setting things out on an entirely truthful and straightforward basis. Those practices demeaned my trade. They undermined the moral authority of newspapers to highlight the bad behavior of others. And those are issues which now, I think, to many people undermine stories which are making them question perhaps their political views, making them question the people who they elect, things which are awkward for them as a reader or a viewer. I think it's very easy now for people, in part because of the bad behavior of the media, to be able to cast that aside and say, well, why would you believe anything there? Sure, they're all crooks, they're hacking phones, whatever it might be. That is very dangerous for journalism. And I think that is something which, in my experience, has significantly been improved over recent years. There is a much tougher, certainly in the print media, there is a much tougher set of standards now by which we are bound. There is the Independent Press Standards Organization, which really has got very significant powers to force us to publish, for instance, a front page correction or retraction if they look at something and say that we've got it profoundly wrong. And so there are things which have changed there. But I think that it's all very well for the media to be able to say that we have changed. People only believe these things when they see them and over a protracted period of time. In life, I think it's true to say that almost anywhere, being skeptical is healthy. Asking lots of questions, living with curiosity, probing what we're being told. And not everyone in government views that curiosity, certainly not from people like me, or even from people like you as members of the public, as positive. And yet having someone outside our government skeptically questioning how it's functioning, what it's doing, is uniquely important in Northern Ireland, because here we're not only a very small society, and that in itself increases the risk of corruption and bad behaviour, but we also have no opposition at Stormont. We have a government system where there are 90 MLAs and only 6 of those MLAs are not in governing parties. That's an extraordinary statistic. The government is scrutinising the government. It's a system which I think is ripe for groupthink and for much, much worse, for open and outright corruption. And so therefore, skepticism about what is being done by our representatives in our name is particularly important in Northern Ireland. In any walk of life, asking awkward questions is central to refining arguments, to testing positions, and to uncovering the worst of human behaviour. But the alternative to skepticism is cynicism. And being cynical is part of the problem, I think, because there are multiple reasons as to why that is the case. But the most obvious problem with cynicism is that if everything is irredeemably broken, then why are any of us bothering to point it out or suggesting solutions? Why does it matter if there's another scandal at Stormont? One of the biggest threats, I think, to journalism and to democracy is something which the media inadvertently really has had a role in amplifying. And that is the idea that they're all the same, the idea that nothing will ever change, the idea that there's no point voting, there's no point really taking an interest in these things. Everybody in politics is a crook, they're all up to their necks in this. And so therefore, why would any of us bother with it? And I know politicians who very much meet that description, and people who are really little short of scoundrels, the sort of people I wouldn't leave my children with, frankly. And yet I know others who are exceptionally dedicated public servants, people who work vast hours for less pay than they received in their previous employment, because they believe in the principle of public service and because they genuinely believe that their political philosophy will make society a better place. And they will disagree as to how that should happen. They might be left or right, they might be unionist or nationalist, or they might be somewhere in the middle. That's not really important. The importance is that they are genuinely trying to effect change, trying to make things better. And that is at the heart of what politics ought to be, and what politics is at its best. And I think one of the challenges for us in the media is to give a more rounded picture of politics and of government, to attempt to question the cynics when they speak out to say that all civil servants are morons or all politicians are corrupt or whatever it might be. They're not. And I think it's important that we try to convey that. But there is a fundamental difficulty, I think, in getting that message across in the media. We operate on the premise, and I think all of us in our lives operate on the premise, that most of the system around us is functioning either entirely correctly or almost entirely as it should. And that when we discover something which is broken, that is an aberration. That is something that is alarming, it's concerning, it's newsworthy. It's something which makes us sit up and think and question and tell people. And it is because it is an aberration that we as journalists report those things. Think about it like this. Today, there will have been tens of thousands of people, I think, who will have travelled around Northern Ireland by car. They'll have done that safely. They'll have got to their destination, and they'll have got out of their car. They'll have gone to do their shopping or to see their friends, whatever it might be. We don't report that as news. It's not something which is going to be in tomorrow's newsletter or Belfast Telegraph. But if there's a crash in which someone is killed, we will report that because it's surprising. It's not what any of us expect to happen when we get into our cars. And if there's a horrific crash, if 10 people are killed in a dreadful accident on the M1 tonight, that will be in the front page of every newspaper tomorrow morning. That is, I think, something which is inevitable. I think it's actually right. And yet it shows, I think, the difficulty in trying to convey what is actually happening in a context which gets across that this has happened, this is shocking, it is something you ought to be aware of, you ought to be concerned about, but don't take this to mean that everyone had this experience, that this is the overwhelming view of what is happening. That is something which I think is really an inherent difficulty to how news is reported, whether in print or online or in the broadcast media. And it really is also, I think, something which is inherent to how we would explain a story verbally to a friend if we had that experience. We don't pass on the boring news that everything is fine or everyone's happy or everyone is working as they should. We pass on the news that something is seriously wrong. That is human nature. It's what is at the essence of what makes news. And I think that sometimes when people say, why can't we have more good news? They fail to understand that actually, if that is what we were to deliver in newspapers, we as human beings simply wouldn't be interested in it. That's not to say that there isn't incredibly interesting and important good news that that either is being covered or should be covered to a greater extent. Of course, there are brilliant stories. News is not all bad, but when it comes to politics, when it comes to uncovering the truth about what has gone on, when it comes to things like corruption or questioning those in power and holding them to account, I think that there is a almost inevitable preponderance towards a situation in which that is more skewed towards the negative rather than the positive. And so therefore, I think there is scope here for us as citizens to be better informed as to what the news means, as to how to interpret it. And I think there's a role here for schools to really teach media literacy. It is so important to our lives. It is so central to how we understand the world today. And yet it's something which I think very few people actually have a good grasp of, even if they read newspapers regularly, even if they watch the television news regularly. And explaining that, I think, to children or to teenagers as to how to understand the news, but not to be overwhelmed by it, is, I think, something that would actually improve things both for us as journalists, because it would help those people to see what we do in context and not take it out of context, but also would be in the interests of society as a whole, because we would have a better understanding of the world which surrounds us. One of my biggest concerns is about the places that as the media shrinks and as journalism gets smaller, reporters just aren't looking anymore. Let's take an example in Northern Ireland, which is familiar to me as a political journalist, and that is local councils. There are 11 councils in Northern Ireland now. There used to be 26, and they're often just not covered anymore. Certainly not by the daily newspapers, and often even by weekly newspapers, by local newspapers. They're covered at best often in a cursory way. There are exceptions to this. There are fantastic local newspapers like the County Down Spectator or the Impartial Reporter, but generally there is a pretty relentless direction of travel for those papers as well as for daily newspapers in Northern Ireland. And yet those councils have increased powers over recent years, particularly when it comes to planning. That is an area which I think most of you will be familiar with is really ripe for corruption. It's something where most people will have a story to tell you about something where they have heard about something which either smelt very bad or which they were involved in and they believe involved corruption. We know that in other jurisdictions, particularly in the Republic, there was a real problem with planning and brown envelopes and councillors being involved in this. And yet that is an area where there is now less scrutiny than there used to be. And one of the things which can help to offset this loss of journalists physically being there in all the meetings and listening to what's said and picking up on something that seems a bit odd is technology. And that is something which can, to a certain extent, be a safeguard against some of the worst of human behavior. And so, for instance, something as simple as audio recording of meetings is very important. That was something which was introduced by Stormont as a requirement for lots of council meetings several years ago, partly because of this concern. It was something that we as a newspaper at the newsletter argued for vociferously, but some parties were very vocal in opposing that, particularly the DUP were very opposed to that. And so therefore I think that as journalism shrinks, as there are less bodies to go round, as there are less people paying attention to this, having records, good records, which is much more achievable now than it was even 20 years ago, is particularly important in trying to be a bulwark against the worst excesses of the powerful within our society. Lots of what I've said here has been, I think it's fair to say, somewhat on the negative side, glass half empty territory. And perhaps some of you are looking at this and thinking, well, you know, he's a journalist. This is exactly what we expected. And yet, coming full circle to where we started, talking about America, talking about some of the developments there with Donald Trump, some of the really dramatic changes that we saw under his presidency, we also see the glimmers of real hope for the future of journalism. We see that in the deepest trough for journalism in America, journalism was revived. It was something which, at the point where people realized that journalism mattered most, they suddenly realized, actually, we're losing something that's important. We need a bulwark against somebody who is potentially quite bad, quite dangerous, potentially even mad, and having people who are in there asking the awkward questions, recording what is done, scrutinizing government documents, reporting for us on behalf of readers and viewers of the media outlets that they represent is particularly important. And it was reassuring to me as a journalist to see how many people in America realized that journalism matters in a democracy, and they were prepared to pay for it. Every time Donald Trump would attack some of the major American media outlets, such as the New York Times, they would see a spike in subscriptions, both online and in print. And that, I think, is something which really gives considerable hope for the future, that actually there is a bottom to the trough that journalism has been heading towards, and that actually, while it might be smaller in the future and it might not get back to the very powerful position that it was in 40 years ago, actually that's not necessarily a bad thing. Perhaps journalism was too powerful, certainly in places like London, and that actually that is something which in itself brought problems, but having an effective well-resourced journalistic core who are scrutinizing the powerful is something which is crucial. And I think that over the last year, just bringing this more up to date and looking at this in the context of the pandemic that we're still in, we've also seen that journalism in this country, and in my experience, journalism at the newsletter, at the Belfast Telegraph, at the Irish News, at the other media outlets in Northern Ireland and on these islands, has faced really its greatest challenge for decades, a challenge that was greater than the Troubles in ways which would have been difficult to imagine at that point, where newspaper offices were being bombed or journalists were being threatened, in some cases killed or intimidated. But something which just overnight transformed an industry which was already on its knees, which was struggling to make sense of the digital world, of how people were leaving newspapers, of how advertisements were leaving newspapers, of how the sums just weren't adding up in many cases. And yet at that point, we saw the greatest moment of hope emerging for a sustainable future for print journalism in particular. The pandemic was really disastrous for newspaper sales, particularly in those first few months where we were really tightly locked down. People couldn't leave home. So obviously they, in many cases, couldn't get their newspaper. Newspaper sales are disproportionately to the elderly. Those were the people who were most at risk. Those were the people who were most cautious in many cases about going out. And so there was just this massive problem that faced newspapers in particular. There were some innovative ways of getting around that. There were things like newspaper deliveries, which in many cases for a newspaper like the Newsletter and the Irish News was not something that we had done before. We both came together with the Daily Mirror and came up with a scheme where we were able to operate that across much of Northern Ireland. That helped some people, but it's not really a long-term solution in the sense that it's very expensive, particularly in rural areas for a daily newspaper. And so therefore, there was a limit to what that could do. But the real dramatic change that we've seen over the last year has been an explosion of people subscribing online. We've seen that at the Newsletter, figures going through the roof from a very low base where people had this concept that news is free online, that you don't pay for anything online, that you just click onto the BBC or you click onto the Belfast Telegraph or the Irish News or whatever it might be, and that there is no price to that. And suddenly people realized that actually, if they didn't pay for this, it was going to go away. They also, in some cases, realized that it was a lot cheaper to pay for a newspaper which was going to be delivered to your iPad that morning without you leaving the house. And it was much handier. And that's something which was replicated, I know, with my colleagues at the Belfast Telegraph, the Irish News, the Irish Times, but also at really most of the major newspapers across much of the Western world where print journalism had been in decline, in England, in Scotland, in America, in Canada, in places where there really seemed to be a bleak future for journalism, serious journalism that holds power to account. Suddenly that was transformed overnight. And that, I think, is something which offers really significant hope for the future. It may well be that the assertive journalism, which I know that I love as a print journalist, being able to pick up a newspaper, to have the ink on my fingers, to be able to turn the pages, have that sense of completion when you've finished reading the newspaper, which you simply don't get on a website where it seems to go on and on forever and it's constantly being updated. That may be something which changes. There may well be less choice, I think, in 10 or 20 years' time. Inevitably, I think we will have less printed newspapers. Newspapers which are printed will be less regularly printed. They'll be printed maybe once a week or twice a week, but not on a daily basis in many cases. And yet that's less important ultimately, and that's a stylistic point, than having journalism which is doing what is at the core of this trade, asking the awkward questions, holding the powerful to account, pointing out their hypocrisy, showing how they've spent our money as taxpayers, and really being something of an irritant within the system, something which questions the received wisdom, which questions groupthink within the system, and that really acts as an arm, if you like, of the public, asking those questions on their behalf. And just finally, my final thought is this, really. We live, I think, in an age where in some ways, we have the greatest democratization of news that has ever existed, certainly in this country, and I think around much of the world. I think many of us don't realize that, because we don't quite understand how our choices as consumers of news lead to news being created. It used to be that there were enormous volumes of research which went into why people bought newspapers or magazines. Was it the front page story? Was it a sports story? Was it a supplement that was in the paper that day? Was it the jobs advertisements that day? It was very difficult ultimately to get an answer to that. People would go round and they would ask 1,000 people what did they buy the paper for that day, but ultimately it was very imperfect. Even those people who picked up the paper might not quite have realized what they were interested in, or when they got to the end of reading that edition, the answer to that question might have changed. But now the guessing in that has gone. We can now track not only how many people have read a story, but we can track to the second how long they spend reading that story. We can see what works, what doesn't work, what people are interested in, what we think people are interested in and we're wrong about. And we can ultimately have a much greater sense of what the public want to read and what they're prepared to read. And one of the healthy elements of the RHI scandal, to my mind, which ultimately I think was a really positive thing for Northern Ireland, which might seem like a very strange thing to say given how disastrous that scheme was, how disastrously it was managed, how much public money was squandered, how even many of those people who installed boilers were treated terribly unfairly in the end, how many people who were up to their necks in that scandal got away with it. There were many things to be annoyed about, to be angry about, to be upset about with that. But ultimately, the thing which I think was most positive about that was that it did uncover stones that had never been turned over, in some cases in the history of Northern Ireland since 1921. And the other element of that was that the public reacted in a very significant way to how that story emerged. When BBC Spotlight came out at the end of 2016, when Jonathan Bell did that very dramatic interview with Stephen Nolan, when we reported on the story in the newsletter, etc., there was not a shrugging of the shoulders from most people. There was a visceral rage at what had gone on. The public played a really crucial role, to my mind, in that story being told. Without the public reaction, that story would not have had the impact which it had. That was what drove Sinn Féin to collapse Stormont. It's a separate issue as to whether that was the right thing. It wasn't something which I think was necessary at that point. The key element there was getting a public inquiry, something that had the powers to uncover the truth. Whether Stormont was there or not, really, I don't think was going to be terribly important in getting to the truth. But the impact of that was seen, I think, in a party which started out really doing everything it could to try to gloss over this, trying to work with the DUP, as they had done in the past, to try to have some sort of faux outrage about this, pretend that there was a really rigorous inquiry, but actually not giving it the powers to get to the truth, not giving it the power to compel documents and witnesses, not giving it the power to take evidence under oath, etc. What propelled that party into doing what it ultimately did was the anger from voters. And that, to my mind, is a profoundly healthy thing. Because one of the things that I see in my job is how demand for a story feeds the supply. So if you click on a clickbait headline, maybe something about a celebrity or something about a dramatic weather event, about some sort of apocalyptic storm that's going to allegedly wipe out Ballymena tomorrow or something of that nature, you can expect to get more of that. You are giving you're feeding the demand side of the equation, and the supply side will meet that demand. With RHI, the public clicked on this story and they kept doing so. That was what made my job much easier when I went to my editor and kept asking for more and more time to look into what, in the absence of that proof that there was interest from the public, might have been seen as, frankly, a pretty niche pursuit, something that was pretty unimportant in the interests of many people. And so probably more than at any point, I think, in the history of journalism, you as the public, I as a member of the public, we all have a significant role to play in what gets published. And that ultimately is an incredibly powerful thing, because in a democracy, truth is central, and to be able to have democracy, and to be able to have democracy that actually functions. If we are going to make decisions about who rules us, we have to be able to do that on the basis of factual, truthful information. Without that, we are living in a lie. We are existing in a heavily spun fabrication, and that is not democracy. It's not the sort of democracy that I want to live in. It's not the sort of democracy I want my children to live in. And so therefore, we can, to a certain extent, rage about some of these things. We can complain about our politicians. We can complain about our media. But actually, there's also something that we can do about it. And that, you'll be delighted to hear, is all that I have to say. So thank you very much for your time.